After a lifetime of sacrifice, Martha thought she had earned the love of her family. But when her husband passes, the true cost of loyalty is revealed. Betrayal lurks in the shadows as her son and daughter-in-law fight for what's hers. With everything at stake, can Martha reclaim her dignity before it's too late? Will she hold her ground, or will her own blood tear her apart? How far would you go to protect what's rightfully yours? It was a day like any other except for the fact that it was the day he was buried. Charles had been gone for 2 weeks now, and the house still felt as cold and empty as it did the moment he passed. The sun hadn't yet risen when Martha sat by the window, gazing out at the fog that had rolled in over the garden. Her hands trembled slightly as they gripped the worn fabric of her robe. The weight of loss had settled deep into her bones, and yet there was something else, something that had been building within her, something she hadn't dared to acknowledge until now. She had spent her life giving, loving, and nurturing. She had sacrificed so much for her family, for her children, for her husband. But as she sat there staring into the mist, she could feel the betrayal starting to seep in, like the early morning dew gathering on the grass outside. It was something she had tried to ignore, but now with Charles gone, the cracks in her world were beginning to widen. Her son James had always been distant, always preoccupied with his own life, his own success. He had married Lisa, a woman whose warmth was as shallow as the skin she wore. Neither of them had ever truly cared for Martha, though they pretended otherwise, especially when it was convenient. They had their own plans for the future, and it didn't include her. Her presence was only a formality, an obligation they had to honor when it suited them. But that day, as Martha sat alone in the house, the sound of footsteps breaking the silence outside caused her heart to quicken. She could hear the low murmur of voices in the distance, the clinking of metal and the steady rhythm of feet on gravel. She knew they were coming, the lawyers. The 2 men who had been tasked with delivering the will of Charles, her late husband. The men who would soon reveal to her the secrets he had hidden away, secrets that had been kept from her for so many years. The doorbell rang, sharp and jarring in the stillness. Martha rose from her chair slowly, the weight of her years settling heavily on her shoulders. She walked across the room and opened the door to reveal the 2 men. They were middle-aged, dressed in dark suits, their faces serious, their eyes cold and detached. One of them, a man named Mr. Harper, stepped forward and handed her a letter. "This is for you, Mrs. Hollingsworth," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "It's from your late husband, Charles." Martha's hands shook as she took the letter, the familiar handwriting on the front of the envelope causing her heart to tighten. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, not like this. With trembling fingers, she tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The words were brief but clear. "Martha, my dear, I've made a decision that will surprise you. You've given me everything, and now it's time for you to take what's rightfully yours. Do not trust James or Lisa. There's more at stake than you realize. You have the power to change everything. Don't wait. You'll find the rest of the details with my lawyer. Trust no one." Martha's breath caught in her throat as the words settled in her mind. The letter felt like a lifeline, but also a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. She glanced up at the 2 lawyers, but neither of them seemed surprised. They had clearly seen this kind of thing before. "I don't understand," Martha stammered. "What is this? What is Charles trying to tell me?" Mr. Harper cleared his throat. "We've been instructed to take you to the lawyer's office. He has the full details, Mrs. Hollingsworth. Everything you need to know." Martha nodded slowly, her mind racing. She had known that Charles had secrets, but she had never imagined they would be so deep. The betrayal she had felt in her heart began to turn into something else, a sharp, icy determination. As she stepped out of the house and into the cold morning air, she felt a strange sense of anticipation. Something was about to change, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to be turned upside down. Martha followed the lawyers in silence, her heart pounding as they led her to the lawyer's office. The fog had thickened by the time they reached the small building in the town center, and the air felt heavier, thick with anticipation. Every step she took felt like a move closer to a truth she wasn't sure she was prepared to hear. She had always trusted Charles. Always. Their life together had been filled with love,
even in the quiet moments. But over the years something had shifted. He had felt it. The distance. The small, unspoken things that made her wonder if Charles was keeping something from her. Now, as she walked toward the office, she couldn't help but think that those suspicions had been valid all along. The lawyer's office was a quiet, sterile space, with dark wood paneling and leather chairs that smelled faintly of cigars and old paper. It was exactly what Martha had expected. A place of business, not of emotion. There was no warmth here. No comfort. It was a cold, indifferent environment. The two lawyers sat her down at a large oak desk, and the one called Mr. Harper slid a thick folder across to her. It felt heavy, like the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. Martha's fingers hovered over it for a moment before she opened the file, her eyes scanning the documents inside. She didn't know what she had expected, but it wasn't this. The will was clear. Charles had left everything to her. The house. The money. His business. Everything he had worked for, everything they had built together was hers now. But the words she had read in his letter echoed in her mind. Don't trust James or Lisa. Martha looked up at Mr. Harper, her brow furrowed. What is this? I thought the inheritance would go to James and Lisa. They're my children. Mr. Harper's expression remained neutral, but there was something almost pitying in his eyes. Mrs. Hollingsworth, your husband's will is clear. He left everything to you, not to your son or his wife. And according to his instructions, you are to take full control of his estate. James and Lisa were to have no part in it. Martha's heart dropped. She felt the blood drain from her face. She had suspected there was something off, but to have it laid out so bluntly before her, it was too much to process in one sitting. Why? She whispered, the word leaving her lips before she could stop it. Your husband believed that James and Lisa were not acting in your best interest, Mr. Harper continued, his tone measured. He believed that their intentions were more about securing their future than honoring the family. He had concerns about their treatment of you, Mrs. Hollingsworth, and he wanted you to have full control over everything. The shock of the revelation settled into Martha's bones, making her feel colder than the fog outside. James and Lisa, her own son and daughter-in-law, had been using her all along. She had given them everything, every bit of her time and energy, and this was how they had repaid her? With betrayal, greed, and manipulation? He had always known that something was off. The way they had dismissed her made her feel invisible. Now it made sense. It had never been about family, about love. It had always been about control. They had used her as a pawn, and Charles had known it. I don't understand, Martha said, her voice shaky but firm. Why didn't Charles tell me? Why didn't he trust me with this information? Mr. Harper glanced down at the papers on the desk, then back at Martha. He didn't want to burden you with the knowledge, Mrs. Hollingsworth. He hoped you wouldn't need to know. But he left detailed instructions in the will in case something happened. Martha sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. This was far more than she had bargained for. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about her life, her dignity, and the betrayal of the people she had loved most. She thought back to the years she had spent quietly in the background, supporting her family, taking care of everything while James and Lisa lived their lives as if she didn't matter. They had pushed her aside, taken her for granted, and now they were going to find out just how wrong they were. Martha stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back with a force that made the lawyers exchange a quick glance. I want to see James and Lisa. I need to speak with them. The two lawyers nodded and stood as well, guiding her out of the office. As Martha stepped into the cold air outside, her resolve hardened. She was no longer the vulnerable, forgotten woman she had been. She wasn't going to sit by and let her family tear her apart. The drive back to her house felt long, though it was only a short distance. Martha's mind raced as she thought about what she was going to say to James and Lisa. The anger was bubbling up inside her, but so was the pain. How could they have treated her like this? How could they have taken everything she had done for them and turned it into a scheme to rob her of her dignity? She wasn't sure what she would find when she got home, but she knew one thing for certain. Nothing would be the same again. She would reclaim her place in this family, and if James and Lisa didn't like it, they would have to deal with it. When Martha finally stepped through the door of her home, the familiar scent of her house, a mix of old wood and lavender, filled her senses. She paused for a moment, gathering her strength, before walking into the living room where James and Lisa sat talking quietly. Their faces dropped when they saw her, their eyes narrowing as they stood up. "Martha," James said, his voice flat. "What are you doing here?" Martha stood tall, her back straight, her heart beating in her chest. "I'm here to talk about Charles's will," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Everything he left, it's mine. And I won't be giving it to you." James and Lisa exchanged a look, and Martha saw the realization hit them like a thunderclap. This wasn't how they had expected things to go. But there was no turning back now.
The air in Martha's house was thick with tension as she stood before James and Lisa, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her shoulders. The years of neglect, the manipulation, the betrayal, everything had led to this point. She could see the shock in their eyes as they absorbed the truth. Charles, her late husband, had left everything to her, and she was not about to let them take what was rightfully hers. Martha had always been the quiet one in the family, the one who took care of the details, the one who stayed in the background. But she wasn't that woman anymore. The truth of her inheritance, Charles's final gift to her, had opened her eyes to the depths of her own strength, a strength she had buried for far too long. As she stood there, her heart still racing, she realized something. She wasn't just reclaiming her property. She was reclaiming her dignity, her voice, her power. For so many years she had been the one to put everyone else first. It was time to stop. It was time to take what was hers and finally make a stand. James and Lisa remained silent for a moment, each trying to process what Martha had said. It was clear they had not expected her to be so resolute. Lisa was the first to speak, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Lisa's tone was condescending, her lips curled into a forced smile. "You really think Charles would want you to have all of this? He knew how much we needed it. James and we've worked so hard to build our lives." Martha's eyes narrowed as she listened to Lisa's words. She had heard this before, the same tired excuses. They had worked hard, yes, but they had worked to take what belonged to her. To take advantage of her kindness and her quiet nature. She had let them. "I've heard enough, Lisa," Martha said, her voice steady and unwavering. "You both thought I was too old to care. You thought you could take everything and leave me with nothing. But you were wrong. Charles knew exactly what he was doing when he left everything to me." James clenched his fists at his sides, his face turning red with anger. "You don't understand," he snapped, stepping toward her. "This isn't about you or me or what Charles wanted. This is about what's fair. You're too old for this. You don't even know what to do with all of this." Martha took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to back down. "I've lived longer than you, James. I've seen more than you. You don't get to decide what's fair. This is mine and I will do with it as I see fit." Lisa laughed bitterly, her eyes hardening. "You think this is some kind of game, don't you? You really believe you can just take everything from us?" Martha's jaw clenched. "I'm not taking anything from you. You've already taken from me my respect, my dignity, my family. I'm just taking back what should have been mine all along." The silence that followed was suffocating. James and Lisa exchanged another glance, but this time, there was no more smug confidence in their eyes. Martha could see the cracks beginning to show. They hadn't anticipated her standing up to them. They hadn't expected her to fight back. "Why?" James asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you share this with us before?" Martha shook her head slowly. "Because you never cared. Not really. You've always seen me as a burden. You never respected me and you certainly never valued me. This wasn't about sharing anything with you. This was about Charles protecting me from people like you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the truth she had kept hidden for so long. It was painful to see the disappointment in her son's eyes, but it was nothing compared to the betrayal she had felt when she realized how they had treated her. She had spent her entire life taking care of them, putting them first, and all they had ever done in return was take and take, never giving anything back. Martha's resolve only strengthened. She was done being the quiet, invisible woman who let everyone else take what they wanted. She was done with the loneliness and the neglect. She had given them everything, and now it was time to give herself something in return: respect, power, and control over her own life. "I'm going to the bank tomorrow," Martha said, her voice firm. "I'll be transferring the assets into my name. You'll have to deal with the consequences of your actions. And as for the house, it's mine now. You can find somewhere else to live." James and Lisa stared at her, their mouths opening and closing as if they were struggling to find the right words. But there was nothing they could say. The truth was undeniable. Martha had taken control, and they were powerless to stop her. As Martha walked away from the confrontation, her heart was still racing, but there was a sense of satisfaction in the air. She had made her decision, and now she would follow through. She wouldn't let them destroy her anymore. They had underestimated her, and now they would see just how wrong they were. The next morning, Martha made her way to the bank with a sense of purpose. She had never been one for flashy displays of wealth or power, but she knew that this was her moment. This was her time to reclaim what was hers and to show her family that they couldn't walk all over her any longer. When she arrived at the bank, she was met by the branch manager, a woman named Sarah, who had worked with Charles for many years. Sarah was kind, but she could sense the tension in Martha's eyes. "Martha," Sarah greeted her warmly, but there was a hint of concern in her voice. "What can I help you with today?" Martha took a deep breath. "I need to transfer everything into my name. Charles left everything to me, and I want to make sure that everything is in order." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "Of course. I'll need to see the proper documents, but we can take care of it right away." As Martha sat in the bank watching the transfer take place, she couldn't help but feel a sense of empowerment. She had fought for this, and now it was finally hers. The house, the business, the wealth. It all belonged to her. And for the first time in years, Martha felt like she was in control.
The days following Martha's visit to the bank were tense. Every inch of her home now felt different, heavier, charged with a new energy. Her house, which once seemed to symbolize comfort and the familiar, now seemed to hum with the electric buzz of change. The documents were signed, the assets officially transferred into her name. Charles's fortune was hers. But with it came a burden she hadn't fully anticipated: the alienation of her son, the erosion of her place in her family. Martha had been prepared for some resistance, but she hadn't been ready for the full weight of the humiliation that was to come. The following evening, when she returned from running errands, she found James and Lisa standing in the living room, waiting for her. They had clearly been discussing something that made their faces pale and tight with anger. "Martha," James said, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk." Martha's heart sank. She knew exactly what this was about. She had expected this conversation to happen sooner or later, but nothing could have prepared her for the bitterness in his voice. The resentment that had been simmering under the surface for years was now spilling out, threatening to consume everything in its path. "I'm listening," Martha said, her voice steady, though she could feel the tightening in her chest. Lisa stepped forward, her expression a mix of frustration and anger. "You have no right to do this," she spat, her words cutting through the air like a sharp knife. "This isn't just about money, Martha. This is about control. You've taken everything from us. Everything we've worked for." Martha raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "Everything you worked for? Or everything we worked for, Lisa? I gave you both everything: my time, my love, my support. And this is how you repay me? By trying to take what was mine from the start." James's face twisted with disgust. "You don't understand. We were counting on that money. We needed it, Mom. You've made things impossible for us. You've left us with nothing." The words hit Martha harder than she expected. They had been playing her all along, taking advantage of her, knowing full well that she would never fight back. The realization of it stung more than she cared to admit. She had spent decades believing that family was about unconditional love, about supporting one another no matter what. But now, with everything laid bare, it was clear that her son and his wife had seen her as nothing more than a stepping stone, someone to be used and discarded once they had gotten what they wanted. Her heart burned with a deep sense of injustice, but she knew that anger alone wouldn't get her anywhere. This wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about taking back her life, about regaining the respect she had lost. and she was going to make sure they understood exactly what they had done. You think I don't understand? Martha's voice was calm, but it held an edge of steel. You think I'm the one who's blind here? I've spent my whole life giving to you both, sacrificing everything for you. And this is how you repay me? By stripping me of my dignity, my power. Lisa sneered. You've always been weak, Martha. Always. Just like your husband. You were never strong enough to handle things on your own. We did everything for you. We took care of the family. But now you're making everything about you. And it's not fair. Martha's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. The humiliation she felt was unbearable, but she forced herself to stay calm. She would not let them see her break. Not now. I'm not weak, Martha said, her voice rising with quiet conviction. I am stronger than you think. And I won't let you manipulate me anymore. The silence between them thickened, the tension so palpable it felt suffocating. James and Lisa stood there staring at her, clearly stunned by her response. They hadn't expected this. They had thought she would cave, that she would give in to their demands. But Martha was done being the victim. She was done being invisible. You've made your choice, James said finally, his voice thick with bitterness. But don't expect us to forgive you. This isn't just about money. This is about what you've done to the family. You've broken us. Martha stood tall, her chin held high. No, James. You've broken the family. You and Lisa. I was never the one who did that. You've pushed me aside for too long, thinking that I wouldn't fight back. But now you'll see just how wrong you were. Her words were cutting, and she could see the flicker of doubt in James's eyes. The smugness had disappeared, replaced by something more primal. Fear. Lisa, on the other hand, seemed unable to mask her fury. She had always believed she could control Martha, but now that Martha was standing firm, she was losing her grip. Do what you want, Lisa spat, her voice filled with venom. We're done with you. You'll see how far your little game takes you. And with that, the two of them turned and left, the door slamming behind them with a finality that left the house eerily quiet. Martha stood still, her fists clenched at her sides. Her heart was pounding, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and most of all, resolve. She had done the right thing. She had stood up for herself. But the pain of seeing her family turn their backs on her, still stung. The years of neglect, of quiet sacrifice had led to this moment. And now the fight was only just beginning. As Martha sat in the silence of her home, her mind raced. The confrontation had been difficult, but it had also been freeing. She wasn't going to let them take away her power again. She had learned long ago how to navigate the complexities of family dynamics. But now she was no longer playing their game. She was in control of her own destiny. The road ahead would not be easy. She knew that. There would be more battles, more moments of doubt. But for the first time in years, Martha felt like she had a chance to rewrite her own story, to take back the parts of her life that had been stolen from her. And as the night fell, Martha made a silent vow to herself. She would never let anyone push her aside again.
The silence that followed James and Lisa's departure echoed through the house, and for a long while, Martha simply stood there in the dim light, taking in the weight of what had just happened. She could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall, a rhythmic reminder of how time had moved on, how much time she had spent giving to her family and how little they had returned. She had always been the one to endure, to stay quiet and let things pass. But now, with everything on the line, she could feel something stirring inside her. A new strength, a new resolve. The feeling of humiliation still clung to her, sharp as a knife. She had never imagined that her own son and daughter-in-law would betray her in such a brutal way. The thought of how they had manipulated her, how they had taken advantage of her kindness, filled her with a quiet fury. But along with the anger there was something else. A realization. They had underestimated her. And now they would learn just how wrong they were. Martha took a deep breath, steadying herself. She could feel her heart still racing, the rush of adrenaline making her hands tremble. But the more she thought about it, the clearer the path ahead became. This was her time. Her chance to reclaim the respect she had lost, not just from her family but from herself. She walked to the kitchen, her steps measured and deliberate. The soft glow of the overhead light illuminated the room, casting long shadows on the floor. Martha's gaze fell on the old china set Charles had bought her years ago, a small reminder of the life they had built together. It was strange how the smallest things could carry so much weight. The memories, the years, the quiet sacrifices. But those days were over. She was no longer the invisible woman in the background. She was no longer the one who quietly accepted her fate. She was the one in charge now. And if James and Lisa thought they could push her around, they had another thing coming. Martha picked up the phone and dialed the number she had been avoiding for weeks. The line rang for a moment before it was picked up on the other end. Martha. It was Sarah, the branch manager at the bank. I need to talk to you about something, Martha said, her voice steady but firm. I'm going to need access to everything. The business, the accounts, everything Charles left behind. I want to take control of it all. There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. Are you sure about this, Martha? It's a big step. Charles always handled the business side of things. I'm sure, Martha replied, her voice unwavering. I need to do this. It's time for me to take my place. Sarah was silent for a moment, perhaps considering Martha's request. All right, I'll get the paperwork together. You'll need to come down to the bank to sign everything. Thank you, Sarah, Martha said, a quiet satisfaction filling her. She had made the decision. This was the first step in taking back what was hers. The next morning, Martha woke early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. She made her coffee slowly, savoring the moment of peace before the storm. Today would be different. Today she would take control. As she prepared to leave for the bank, she took a moment to look around her home. The house felt different now, emptier somehow but also full of possibilities. The air felt lighter, more open, as if the weight of years of suppression had finally lifted. She had spent so much of her life waiting for others, for her family to recognize her value, to see her worth. But now she was going to show them. She was going to show them that Martha Hollingsworth was a force to be reckoned with. When she arrived at the bank, she was met by Sarah, who led her into a private room. The paperwork was already laid out in front of her, ready for her signature. Martha sat down, her hands steady as she signed each document with a firm, decisive stroke. The weight of the moment was not lost on her. This was more than just a legal transaction. This was a declaration. A declaration that Martha Hollingsworth was no longer the woman who quietly accepted the role she had been given. She was taking charge of her life now, and no one, least of all her own family, would stand in her way. As Sarah handed her the final papers, she looked at Martha with something like admiration. I have to say, Martha, I've seen a lot of clients come and go. But you're something else. I can't say I'm surprised, though. You always had a certain strength about you. Martha smiled, but it wasn't the smile of the woman who had been passive for so many years. This was a smile of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. It's time for me to show that strength, Sarah. Time for me to take what's mine. Back at her home, Martha sat in the quiet of her living room, the documents in front of her. The realization of what she had just done began to settle in. She was no longer just the wife of Charles Hollingsworth. She was Martha Hollingsworth, the woman who had reclaimed her power. The phone rang, breaking the silence. It was James. Martha picked up the receiver, her breath steady. She knew what was coming. Mom, I don't understand, James said, his voice strained. Why are you doing this? This isn't what Dad wanted. He didn't want you to be alone in all of this. Martha took a deep breath, her voice calm but firm. You're right, James. This isn't what Charles wanted. But I'm not doing this to be alone. I'm doing this because it's what's best for me. You and Lisa have pushed me aside for too long. You've never treated me with respect, and I won't stand for it anymore. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Martha could almost hear the gears turning in James's mind. You don't get it, Mom. We've always been a family. We've always been there for each other. Martha shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. No, James. You've never been there for me. You've been there for yourselves. And now it's time for me to take care of me. She hung up the phone before he could respond, her heart pounding but her resolve stronger than ever. She wasn't going to let anyone make her feel small again. Not her son. Not Lisa. No one. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Martha sat on the porch looking out at the horizon. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of change. For the first time in a long time, Martha felt a sense of peace. She had taken control of her life, and though she knew the road ahead would be difficult, she was ready. Ready to face whatever came next, with her head held high. She wasn't just the mother or the wife anymore. She was Martha Hollingsworth, strong, independent, and in control of her own destiny.
The days that followed Martha's visit to the bank felt like a whirlwind. The papers had been signed, and now, as she sat in the quiet of her home, the full scope of what she had done was beginning to sink in. She was no longer just the mother, the wife, the grandmother. She was the matriarch now, the woman who held the power. The family's foundation had always been Charles, but now, in his absence, the weight of responsibility had shifted to her. But with that power came something else, a sense of unease. She had fought so hard to reclaim what was hers, but now, in the stillness of the house, she wondered what it would cost her. The confrontation with James and Lisa had been expected, but the repercussions were something she hadn't fully considered. Would they try to take it all back? Would they do everything in their power to strip her of the control she had just earned? Martha had spent a lifetime suppressing her emotions for the sake of family harmony. She had always been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and tried to keep everyone together. But now that role seemed like a distant memory. The fight for her rightful place was just beginning, and it would be a fight to the end. That afternoon, as she sat in her favorite chair by the window, looking out at the garden that Charles had lovingly tended to for years, the phone rang. Martha glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the caller ID. It was James. She hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone, her fingers steady despite the sudden rush of adrenaline. "Mom," James's voice came through, soft but heavy with emotion. "I don't know what to say. I didn't expect you to do this." Martha's grip tightened on the receiver. She knew what was coming. This was the moment when James would try to convince her to change her mind. He would tell her how wrong she was, how much he and Lisa needed the money, how much they had sacrificed for her over the years. "You don't need to say anything, James," Martha said, her voice steady but firm. "I've made my decision. I'm not going to apologize for taking what's mine." "Mom, this isn't just about the money," James continued, his voice rising in frustration. "This is about family. About what's right." Martha felt a pang in her chest at his words, but she refused to let it sway her. For too long she had put their needs above her own. For too long she had believed that family came first, that love was enough to fix everything. But now she saw the truth. They had never cared about her. Not really. Not in the way a family should. "You're right, James," Martha said, her voice quieter now but still resolute. "This isn't just about money. This is about respect. You and Lisa have taken everything from me for years. My time, my love, my energy, and I've given it all freely. But now it's my turn. Now it's my life to live." There was silence on the other end of the line. Martha could hear James breathing heavily, as if he were struggling to find the words. Finally he spoke, his voice low and defeated. "I don't know what to say, Mom. I just don't understand." "Why now?" "Because I've spent my whole life being the one who was always there, always giving," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. "But no one ever gave anything back. I've been invisible for too long, James. And I won't be invisible anymore." The line went silent again, but this time, it wasn't just the distance between them. It was the weight of the truth that Martha had just spoken. For the first time in years she had spoken for herself, and it felt like a small victory. James's voice broke the silence once more. "I don't want to lose you, Mom. But I don't know how to fix this." Martha's heart softened at his words, but she knew that she couldn't let him manipulate her again. She had spent too many years letting him push her around, letting him think that his needs came before hers. It was time for her to stand firm. "I don't want to lose you either, James," she said quietly. "But you need to understand that I can't keep letting you take from me. I can't keep being the one who gives and gives without ever getting anything in return. I've made my choice. Now it's time for you to make yours." She hung up the phone without waiting for a response. The conversation had been difficult, but she knew it was necessary. She had drawn a line in the sand, and now there was no turning back. James and Lisa would have to learn to respect her, or they would have to live with the consequences of their actions. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room, Martha sat in the same chair by the window, her thoughts swirling. She had expected some form of resistance from her family, but she hadn't anticipated just how deep the betrayal ran. She had given them everything, her time, her love, her loyalty, and they had taken it all without hesitation. Now she was left to pick up the pieces of her own life, to rebuild what they had torn down. But there was something else stirring within her, something she hadn't expected. Despite the pain, despite the anger, there was a sense of power that she hadn't felt in years. The realization that she was finally in control of her own destiny, that she could finally take what was hers, filled her with a sense of strength. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew this. She was no longer afraid. The fear that had once held her back, fear of losing her family, fear of being alone, fear of rejection, was gone. She had faced down her past and now she was ready to face whatever came next. The phone rang again, but this time it wasn't James. It was a number she didn't recognize. Martha picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly. "Hello. Martha Hollingsworth?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but it was calm, professional. "This is Robert Fields, attorney at law. I'm calling in regard to the estate of your late husband, Charles Hollingsworth. I have some important information to discuss with you." Martha's heart skipped a beat. She had already handled the majority of the legal matters, hadn't she? What more could there be? "I'm listening," she said, her voice steady, despite the unease settling in her stomach. "There's something you need to know, Mrs. Hollingsworth," Robert said. "Charles left behind more than just the assets you've already inherited. There's a trust. A part of the estate that wasn't disclosed to anyone, not even your son." Martha's mind raced. A trust? She hadn't known anything about a trust. "Where is it?" she asked, her voice low but filled with urgency. "It's all here in the final documents," Robert said. "I can send you the details, but I believe this will change everything for you."
The revelation of the trust had shaken Martha to her core. She had spent days processing the inheritance, reclaiming her place in the family, and now this new piece of information threatened to upend everything she thought she knew about Charles and his intentions. What had he hidden? What was this trust, and why had it been kept from everyone? The phone call from Robert Fields had come as a surprise, but what he had told her was even more astonishing. A part of Charles's estate had been kept secret, not only from her but from everyone. The lawyer had been vague, only hinting at something that would change everything. And now Martha was determined to find out what that meant. After hanging up the phone with Robert, Martha sat back in her chair, her mind whirling. For the first time in her life, she was the one in control of her own future. She had made it this far. She had reclaimed her dignity, her property, and her rights. But now it seemed Charles had left her with one more puzzle to solve. A puzzle that could give her even more power, or possibly destroy everything she had fought for. She couldn't wait to find out. The next day she went to the lawyer's office to collect the papers that Robert had promised her. The journey there was longer than usual, her nerves making the ride feel as if it lasted forever. She kept thinking about the years of silence between her and Charles, the years when they had lived under the same roof but never truly communicated. The life they had built had always been centered on his needs, his work, his goals. Martha had played the supporting role, never asking for more, always content to let him take the lead. But now that was over. She was no longer just Charles's wife. She was Martha Hollingsworth, strong, independent, and unafraid to claim what was rightfully hers. When she arrived at the office, Robert greeted her with a smile, though his eyes were filled with an unsettling seriousness. "Mrs. Hollingsworth, it's good to see you," he said, his voice polite but guarded. "I have the documents here for you. Please take a seat." Martha sat down, her hands clammy as she took the folder from him. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. Her breath caught as she saw the word, "trust," written at the top of the first page. "This trust," Robert began, "was set up by your husband some years ago. It's separate from the estate that was left to you, but it holds a significant portion of assets that were never disclosed to the family. It appears that your husband was concerned about something. Perhaps he knew what was coming, Or perhaps he just wanted to ensure your security after his passing. Martha looked up at him, her mind racing. What do you mean by, concerned about something? What did he think was coming? Robert hesitated before answering. I can't say for sure, but there's a clause in the trust that specifically restricts access to certain individuals. It was structured in such a way that only you could access it, but you needed to meet certain conditions. I believe Charles wanted to make sure that, if something happened to him, you wouldn't be taken advantage of. Martha's pulse quickened. And what are these conditions? Robert adjusted his glasses, then slid a sheet of paper across the desk toward her. This clause here details that you must wait at least 6 months after Charles's death before you can fully access the funds in the trust. There are also stipulations about how the funds can be used. But most importantly, the trust contains assets that were never included in the original will. The land, the business holdings, and some private investments, all of it is locked away in the trust. Martha's fingers trembled as she looked over the documents. This was more than she had ever expected. The trust was not just a safety net for her. It was a weapon, one that could give her power over everything she had fought for. But there was one thing Martha knew for sure. If she was going to take control of this situation, she needed to act quickly. James and Lisa would never accept her having more than what Charles had already left her. They were already bitter about the inheritance, and this new development would only make them more desperate. She knew what she had to do. The days that followed were filled with calculated steps. Martha made several calls to legal advisors and financial experts, ensuring that she understood exactly what she was up against. She wasn't just dealing with her son's greed anymore. She was dealing with a legacy that had been hidden from her, a legacy that could be the key to her future. She also began to put her plan into motion. She wasn't going to simply sit back and let James and Lisa take everything. She had played the role of the victim for far too long. Now she would make them see that they couldn't control her. They would have to reckon with the consequences of their actions. Martha began to make subtle changes around the house, marking the transition from passive to active. She hired a team of contractors to handle the necessary renovations on the property, making it clear to James and Lisa that the house, her house, was not up for negotiation. She contacted the business partners who had worked with Charles for years, ensuring that they understood that Martha Hollingsworth was now in charge. No more shadows. No more being overlooked. It wasn't just about power or money. It was about respect. It was about reclaiming what was taken from her, not just the physical assets but her very dignity. Martha would not let her family tear her apart anymore. The confrontation came sooner than she expected. A week after her trip to the lawyer's office, James and Lisa showed up unannounced at the house. Martha had been waiting for this moment, though it still made her heart race to see them standing at her doorstep, their faces twisted with anger and frustration. You need to stop this, Mom, James said, his voice sharp. You don't know what you're getting into. This trust, it's not what you think. You're making a huge mistake. Martha looked at him with cold resolve. No, James. I'm not making a mistake. I'm taking control of my own life. Something you've never understood. Lisa stepped forward, her face contorted with disdain. You don't get to have everything, Martha. You don't get to take it all. Charles would never have wanted this. You're nothing but a greedy old woman. Martha didn't flinch at the insult. She had heard it all before. But now it didn't matter. The truth had already been laid out before her, and nothing they said could take it away. Charles may have had his reasons for leaving things the way he did, but I'm the one left to pick up the pieces. I'm the one who has to make the decisions now. And if you can't accept that, then maybe it's time for you to leave. The words hung in the air between them, thick with tension. James's face darkened, but for the first time he didn't say anything. Lisa's lips quivered, but she too said nothing. They had underestimated her for so long, thinking that she would never fight back. They thought they could control her, manipulate her into giving up. But they were wrong. Martha wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't the frail, invisible woman they thought she was. She was Martha Hollingsworth, the woman who had reclaimed her life, and who was now ready to take whatever steps necessary to protect it.
The weight of the decision Martha had made began to settle deeply within her. The trust, with all its hidden assets, had given her a new sense of power and control, but it also came with the heavy responsibility of managing what Charles had left behind. She had no intention of using it recklessly, but the knowledge that she now held the strings to the family's future felt like both a privilege and a burden. In the days that followed, the tension between Martha and James and Lisa only grew. Despite their initial shock, they hadn't given up on trying to convince her to change her mind. They visited, sent letters, and even tried to guilt her into relinquishing the trust, all under the guise of concern for family unity. But each time Martha stood her ground. She had long ago accepted the fact that she could no longer expect love or understanding from them. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about respect. It was about taking back the part of herself that they had stolen over the years. She had prepared for this moment, for the final confrontation that would either break her family apart for good or force them to finally acknowledge her as an equal. The time had come for the full truth to be revealed. Martha was no longer just the widow or the mother who quietly accepted the role they had given her. She was the woman who had reclaimed her place in the world. It happened late one evening, the first real storm of the season rolling in with the thick clouds and the heavy winds. Martha sat by the window looking out at the darkened garden, the trees bending under the force of the storm. Seemed almost fitting. She had weathered so much in her life, and now she was standing at the threshold of something bigger. The storm outside mirrored the storm within her, tumultuous, raw, and full of uncertainty. But it was also a sign that things were changing. For the first time she felt truly alive. Her phone rang, breaking the silence of the room. She picked it up, her heart racing as she saw the name on the caller ID. It was Robert Fields, the lawyer who had been helping her with the trust. "Martha." Robert's voice was calm but urgent. "I've been going over the final documents and there's something I think you need to know." Martha's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "There's more to the trust than we originally thought," Robert said, his voice lowering. "Charles set it up with more conditions than we realized, conditions that change the way the assets can be used. I've been going over the stipulations and there's something in there that you might want to consider very carefully." Martha's mind raced. "What do you mean? What does it say?" "There's a clause that gives you full control of the family business, but it also gives you the power to dissolve it. There's a provision that allows you to sell off assets if you see fit, but it also places certain restrictions on how those assets are divided. Most importantly, it includes an option for you to cut ties with anyone who poses a threat to your control, whether that's your son or anyone else in the family." Martha felt a chill run through her. This was more than she had ever expected. Charles had left her the means to take full control of her own future, but he had also given her the power to sever ties with anyone who sought to undermine her. "I can't believe it," Martha whispered. "Charles actually thought I would need to cut them out. He knew how far they would go." "Charles was a shrewd man," Robert said softly. "He saw the signs. He saw the way things were heading. This trust was more than just a financial safety net. It was a safety net for your dignity, for your future. And now it's time to decide what you're going to do with it." Martha stood up, her hands trembling slightly as she held the phone to her ear. She had spent so many years playing the role of the dutiful wife and mother, sacrificing herself for the family. But now she was faced with a choice. The power was hers, but with it came the burden of a decision that would shape everything. She walked to the window, staring out at the storm as it raged outside. The thunder rumbled in the distance as if the earth itself was urging her to act. Martha took a deep breath, then made her decision. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "I'll cut them out. I won't let them destroy what's mine." The next morning, Martha made the calls that would change everything. She contacted the financial advisors, the real estate agents, and the legal team, informing them of her decision to move forward with the dissolution of the family business. She had already started making arrangements for the sale of the properties, ensuring that the transactions were done swiftly and discreetly. She didn't need James or Lisa's approval. She didn't need their permission. When James and Lisa arrived later that day, Martha was waiting for them. She didn't hesitate when they entered, their faces full of expectation. They had come to talk, to plead, to convince her to reverse her decision. But Martha was done listening. She had already made her choice and there was no going back. "I've made my decision," Martha said, her voice steady as she looked at them both. "The business is being dissolved. The properties are being sold. The assets are being liquidated. And you, James, will not see a dime of it. Lisa scoffed. You can't do this, Martha. You're just an old woman who's lost her mind. You don't know what you're doing. Martha's eyes locked onto Lisa's. No, Lisa. You're the ones who don't know what you're doing. You thought you could manipulate me, take advantage of me. But now you'll learn the hard way that I'm not someone you can push around. James took a step forward, his face twisted in anger. You don't get to do this, Mom. We're your family. You're supposed to care about us. I do care about you, James, Martha replied, her voice calm but unwavering. But I've spent my whole life putting your needs above mine, and I won't do it anymore. I'm taking control of my life. And if that means cutting you out, then so be it. James's face paled as the gravity of Martha's words sank in. He stood there, speechless, as Lisa's anger boiled over. You're a traitor. Lisa screamed, her voice shrill. You're selfish. You don't care about anyone but yourself. But Martha didn't flinch. She had heard it all before, and she was done being the victim. I care about myself, Lisa, Martha said softly. And that's all that matters now. With that, James and Lisa turned and stormed out of the house, their words of anger and betrayal echoing in the air as they slammed the door behind them. But Martha didn't feel the sting of their insults anymore. She didn't feel their anger or their rejection. She felt free.
The days after the final confrontation passed slowly for Martha, each one feeling like a milestone in her journey toward reclaiming her life. The storm that had raged the night she made her decision seemed to mirror the turmoil inside her. But now, in the aftermath, there was only the quiet, steady rhythm of her heartbeat. She could still hear the echoes of James and Lisa's angry words, the slam of the door as they left, but they were fading. They no longer held the power to hurt her. The years of neglect, manipulation, and abuse of her kindness were now just memories. Memories that no longer had the strength to control her. Martha spent the following days immersed in the details of the business dissolution, the property sales, and the financial arrangements that were all part of her new reality. She was no longer just a passive participant in her own life. She was the one making the decisions. And although the weight of those decisions was heavy, it was also freeing. For the first time in years, Martha felt like she had control. Control over her own future, control over her own happiness. As she sat in her living room, looking out at the garden that Charles had once tended so lovingly, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that had brought her to this point. The years of selflessness, the sacrifices she had made for her family, her children, her husband, and yet, in the end, it had been a one-sided love. A love that had been manipulated, used, and eventually cast aside. For so long she had tried to understand why Charles had done what he did, why James and Lisa had treated her the way they did. But now, as she looked at the empty space where they used to be, it was clearer than ever. They had all taken her for granted. They had never truly seen her for who she was. And maybe that was the real tragedy. Martha wasn't the woman she had once been. She wasn't the meek, submissive wife or the mother who quietly accepted her place. She wasn't the person who was always waiting for someone to notice her, to love her, to care about her. She had finally stopped waiting. And in doing so, she had found something far more valuable than the inheritance or the wealth that now belonged to her. She had found herself. But the road to this realization hadn't been easy. It had been filled with tears, anger, and betrayal. The price of reclaiming her life had been steep. But as Martha sat in the silence of her home, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, she knew it had all been worth it. A few days later, Martha received a letter in the mail. The envelope was familiar. Too familiar. It was from James. She had expected this. She knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to make contact again. She had already decided that she wouldn't let their guilt or their need for forgiveness sway her. She had made her choice. But still, she felt a small pang in her chest as she opened the letter. Martha, I don't know how to start this, and I don't even know if I have the right to ask you to read this. I know what I've done to you. I know that I've failed you as a son. I've spent so many years taking you for granted, thinking you'd always be there, that I didn't need to show you the respect you deserved. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for everything. I know that nothing I say will undo the hurt I've caused, but I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. You were right. You were always right. I was selfish, and I let my own pride and my greed cloud my judgment. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I hope in time, you can at least find it in your heart to understand that I never meant to hurt you. I've been thinking about what you said, that you need to take care of yourself now. And maybe, just maybe, you're right. I see now that I never gave you the chance to live for yourself. I was too busy trying to control everything. I was too blinded by my own desires to see the truth. I know I can't change the past, but I'm willing to try and make things right. I'll respect your decision. I'll let you have what's yours. And I won't ask for anything more. If you ever want to talk, I'll be here. James. Martha stared at the letter for a long time, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it in her hands. She could feel the sincerity in his words, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. She had been his mother, his pillar of support, and yet he had never truly valued her. His apology, though heartfelt, felt like too little, too late. Still, there was something inside Martha that softened. She had spent so long carrying the weight of anger and resentment. Maybe it was time to let it go. Maybe it was time to start healing, not for James or Lisa, but for herself. She folded the letter and set it down on the table, her mind quiet for the first time in weeks. She knew she didn't have to make a decision right away. The time would come when she was ready to face her son, but for now she would take a step back and let the dust settle. She had done enough for everyone else. Now it was time to take care of herself. A few weeks passed and life began to return to a new kind of normal. The property sales were finalized, and Martha had successfully dissolved the family business. The money from the assets had been placed in a trust for her future, a future that she would now build on her own terms. She had never imagined herself in this position, but now, the idea of living without the constant pressure of family expectations felt freeing. The freedom she had craved for so long was finally hers. One evening, as she sat in the living room, the soft light from the lamp casting a warm glow on the walls, Martha reflected on everything that had brought her to this point. She had fought for her place in the world, and now she was standing firmly in it. The road had been long, but she had arrived. And for the first time in years, Martha felt at peace with herself. She had lost her family, but in doing so she had found something far more precious: herself. Martha's journey was one of painful growth, sacrifice, and ultimate self-empowerment. Throughout her life she had been the quiet supporter, the one who gave without asking for anything in return. But when betrayal and greed came knocking at her door, Martha found the strength to stand up for herself. She took control of her inheritance and, more importantly, of her life. By severing toxic family ties and demanding respect, Martha reclaimed her dignity and found the peace she had long deserved. The lesson here is powerful. Never let anyone undermine your worth. Family can sometimes be the source of our greatest pain, but it is also where we can find our strength. The journey of self-empowerment may come with difficult choices, but it's essential to stand firm in your belief that you are deserving of love, respect, and happiness, no matter your age or circumstances. Respect yourself, take charge of your life, and never be afraid to make the hard choices. Even when it feels like everything is falling apart, reclaim your power. You are the one who determines your future. If you're feeling stuck in a situation where you're not being valued, whether it's in your family, your career, or your personal life, know that it's never too late to take charge. Stand up for yourself, draw the boundaries you need, and start living life on your own terms. Your peace and happiness are worth fighting for.